but from ancient tracks, preserved in stone. No one ever thought that pterosaurs were skilled flyers. Their clunky bodies seemed to prohibit anything but gliding. But near Toulouse, France, a new piece of evidence has trashed this myth. Two investigators examined the rarest of pterosaur fossils. Not petrified bones, but fossilized footprints.
It's a unique site in the world. This is the first site that actually preserves pterosaur tracks that everyone agrees are pterosaur tracks.
One set of footprints here is as vivid to trained eyes as a series of flash photographs. It's the only known record of a pterosaur landing. And how a flyer lands reveals how well it controls its flight. Strong thermals in this area attract another flying species, one that only recently discovered the secrets of flight. Paragliders have excellent flight control. They can land slowly. What about pterosaurs? The trackway of this pterosaur reveals extraordinary flight control. It touched down slowly.
We're going to see the animal land like that with the claws this way. So he's landing here and moving forward like that. Then landing again in these tracks here, these two footprints. And then for the first time, the hands come in and they land there.
Weirdly, pterosaurs have hands halfway down their wings. While standing, they bend their megafingers up and back. This trackway reveals a key fact about pterosaur flight. They didn't make a running landing as many birds do. They slowed themselves down during final approach.
So there's basically two ways it can do that. It can glide down, stall with its wings, and drop. Or it can come down, flap its wings to slow its descent, and land very gently. We're not exactly sure how pterosaurs did it, but it looks like they were pretty capable of flapping their wings to slow down like that.
So pterosaurs used their wings as brakes. They weren't clumsy flyers after all.
These are animals that flew very well and were very adept in the air.
The unique landing track also helped solve another mystery: how pterosaurs walked. On two legs, like a bird. On four legs, like a bat. Or did they scoot on their bellies, like penguins?
Because their forelimbs were so long and their hind limbs were shaped so much like birds, I reasoned that they probably would have only walked on two legs, their back legs. But in fact, these tracks showed that they did walk on four legs. You're wrong all the time in science, that's all right.
In the hunt for the ultra-giant, tracks will offer a different kind of evidence. Evidence about size. Fossil footprints recently found in Mexico look like nothing ever seen before.
When we saw these footprints, we could not believe what we saw. We saw footprints of a gigantic flying reptile.
The first reaction, we just stood there, and we stood there with our mouths agape. Nobody could speak, actually. What we saw, we both thought, oh, that's the biggest pterosaur footprints ever.
Fry's understanding of the tracks will be controversial. Prehistoric footprints can be hard to interpret.
A footprint is not simply the shape of the foot that laid it. It's also what condition the ground was, and it's also the kind of motion that an animal makes.
The Mexican tracks have a very elongated type of footfall. And this would appear to be the sort of thing that a pterosaur would make. But it's also the sort of thing that any kind of animal would make if it walked in really mushy ground.
But the hand and foot outlines are so different that Fry concludes only pterosaurs could have left these tracks.
The first thing we did, we measured the size of the feet and the hands and the stride.
Each print is 2.5 feet long. That's a size 72 shoe. But the wildest part is yet to come. At first, it looks as if one print is following another, but Fry thinks these tracks are only those of the left hand and foot. The right prints lay buried nearby. That would mean this thing has a stance nearly 15 feet wide, about the distance from the free throw line to the backboard. The evidence suggests the hip of this monster is just about as high as a basketball hoop. To Fry, the case for a record-breaking giant is coming together. But where does the huge fossil in Israel fit in? Is it somehow connected to the Mexican trackway?
Monster of monsters, big as a skyscraper.
Ever since we figured out what pterosaurs were, they've been living large in our imaginations.
Look out! They've seen us!
But one man was more obsessed than most. Aeronautical engineer Paul McCready. He's known for inventing weird flyers like the Gossamer Albatross, the first human-powered craft to fly across the English Channel. Captivated by pterosaurs, McCready set out in the 1980s to make the giant, Ketz, fly again. His team's biggest challenge was flight control, especially figuring out how to steer. Fossil expert Kevin Padian advised the project.
They thought it really had to have a tail, and it didn't have a tail. But instead, they were very clever. This animal had a very long neck. So they used the neck as the way to balance and steer the animal.
But that's not how real pterosaurs did it. And even with this compromise, sometimes it crashed.
to get it off the ground, get it up in the air. It was fantastic at the time.
We now know pterosaurs mostly relied on their incredibly sophisticated wings for steering. McCrady's wings weren't up to the task. They were an unlifelike, rigid carbon fiber. His solution to flight control was aeronautical. He created an airplane in pterosaurs' clothing. Gerritsen, on the other hand, aims for a lifelike pterosaur that steers like the real thing.
Really what's helping us most is that we know a lot more about pterosaurs. Because lots of fossils have been found, we know much more about how they were built.
Take the head. Fossil evidence shows that pterosaurs like this flew with their heads angled down, not parallel to the ground as McCrady's model did. A lowered head makes flight far more difficult to control. But that's how real pterosaurs did it. Weight is another challenge. Power to weight is the ratio that governs all flight. And here the model has another advantage: new super light components.
The batteries are a lot lighter and very powerful, and that's helping us a lot.
The batteries hold 15 times as much juice per pound as McCrady's did. The servo motors are far smaller, lighter, and more powerful. But the biggest difference is the wing. The goal is to solve the steering problem by copying the complexity of a real pterosaur's wing. McCrady's wing had only a single moving joint, the shoulder. This wing has 5 joints. Now these lifelike wings are ready to be tested. Mounted on the fuselage of a remote-control airplane. They'll fly at about 25 miles an hour, the estimated speed of the living animal. Like a kite, the wing membrane fills with air, taking on an airfoil shape which produces lift.
The membrane's filling very nicely, and so hopefully that means we'll get a bit of lift out of it.
This is the first chance for pilot Michael Luvara to practice steering. To do this, he uses a model airplane radio controller. Just like a real pterosaur, he reacts to the wind by adjusting the shape of the wings. Luvara is filling in for the pterosaur's brain. In this controlled test, the wing membrane works. But untethered, up in the sky, will it fly like the real thing? Getting into the air is such a big technical challenge, it looks like magic. And in pterosaurs, most of that magic is in the wings. At a runway for remote-controlled aircraft, the model's wings are about to be tested. At this stage, though, the model is only part pterosaur. It still needs an airplane tail to steer, and it uses a propeller for takeoff. It may look crude, but it boasts one of the most sophisticated wings ever built. Based on clues from pterosaur fossils, there are 5 movable joints inside the wing for steering. The shoulders rotate. They can also sweep forward and back. The wrists can also rotate and sweep, and the wing can bend at the elbow. Now the object is to experiment with them.
That's the one thing that we're trying to figure out with this replica right now. Which of the joint motions are really critical for control?
The answer was wired into the real pterosaur's brain, so Luvaro will have his work cut out for him.
Here we go.
It flew though.
Wait a second. That servo might be locked.
This one's still high.
Is it now or not? It's still a little high.
The damage is minor. The model will get a second chance.
It looks like it wants to lift off, so we might actually get airborne.
Constant tweaking is what it will take to fly like a pterosaur.
It is a challenge. It's certainly like flying a ball, and you got to keep on trying balancing on top of the ball.
Something wrong with the elbow, so that's better.
Yeah, here we go.
That's amazing! Oh well.
Luvaro couldn't react quickly enough to keep the model in the air.
I would have loved to make it all the way around, but I think we need to do a little more work.
Oh my goodness.
Still, it's a breakthrough. Never before has such an adjustable, lifelike pterosaur wing flown.
Something's loose here. I think we
But what will happen when the model becomes even more realistic?
Okay.
A living pterosaur had a big, meaty head. The animal didn't just glide, it flapped its wings. And the wing membrane itself was much more complex than the single layer of sailcloth tested today. A critical discovery will radically alter the model's wing, bringing it closer to the real thing. In the 1800s, in Germany, bone hunters found a remarkably detailed fossil. Hidden inside, the defining feature of pterosaur wing membranes.
Pterosaur wing membrane is a unique construction in nature. Layer of stiffening fibers controlled the wing shape.
Fibers run diagonally from front to back to stiffen the wing and maintain the airfoil shape. No other flying creature uses this technology. If pterosaurs owned patents, this would be a gold mine. But how do you mimic that solution is ingenious. Nylon line, it's the closest thing to pterosaur wing fibers. Paleo artist Hall Train lays it in at the same angles as real pterosaur fibers. The fibers give a ripstop-like strength to the wing membrane.
So the unique fibers in the pterosaur wing made the wing a lot stronger in this direction from the outer wing that carried the large forces to the inner wing. And that allowed these large forces to be transferred to the upper arm, and that was extremely strong in the pterosaurs. And because of that, the pterosaur wing was allowed to grow much larger than the wings in birds.
These small fibers may be one of the critical features that allowed pterosaurs to grow to be giants. And pterosaur wings have even more secrets. Ultraviolet light allows investigators to see beyond hard bone into soft tissue.
If we look at pterosaur fossils under ultraviolet light, we see structures we never dreamed about.
The first revelation, dark canals. They're blood vessels that nourish and cool the wing membrane. Then, a key find. White flecks indicate muscle that could contract or relax to respond to flight conditions.
Aircraft engineers, they get incredibly jealous because what they like to do is to build a wing that can be adjusted at any place to any circumstance in the air. And the only animals that achieved that were pterosaurs.
Now we have a new picture of pterosaur wing membranes. Their unique layer cake construction may have looked like this. On the bottom are the stiffening fibers that help the wing keep its shape. Next is a layer of skin. On top of that are the muscle and blood vessels revealed by the UV images. The top layer is again skin, now with a fine hair-like covering that may smooth airflow and increase lift. And something in that top layer may have acted as a kind of sunblock.
There's one layer that isolates the wing from the burning sun of the Mesozoic skies.
The wings of bats have no such protection.
Bats, they have the problem of the sun. They have to fly at night in order to avoid sunburn.
In fact, many bats would die if they flew during the day. But pterosaurs could and did rule the daytime skies. With each new discovery, pterosaurs defy our expectations. And a recent find offers yet another twist. Pterosaurs didn't need practice to become amazing flyers. They were born that way. Pterosaurs don't give up their secrets easily. A fundamental fact about these outrageous flyers still eludes us. Were pterosaur babies born live, like some snakes or lizards, or did they hatch from eggs? This question was answered only recently. In China, two paleontologists uncovered a fossil of a tiny, curled-up pterosaur. It was a pterosaur chick inside an egg.
The discovery of the egg was probably the find of the century, because this tells us something about pterosaurs, about how they reproduced, of which we had absolutely no information before. It was pure speculation, and suddenly here we have an egg.
But we don't yet know when young pterosaurs could fly. Dave Unwin has a controversial theory. Evidence shows that many baby pterosaurs died far from the nest.
We find the fossil remains of these individuals miles out at sea. And the only way they could get there is if they were actually flying animals and they got caught in a storm, ended up dead in the water and were buried in the sediments at the bottom.
Could pterosaurs have flown right after hatching? Newborn birds and bats can't because they're awkwardly proportioned. To prove his hunch that pterosaurs could take wing right after birth, Unwin needs more evidence. So he's assembled a rare series of fossils, the same kind of pterosaur at 3 different ages. He measures the length of the bones that make up the arm, then those of the megafinger. Unwin finds that the arm and the megafinger grow at the same rate. So the proportions of the wing don't change at all. As a check, he measures bones that have nothing to do with flying, like the beak. These proportions change, so only the flight-critical bones keep the same ratio. The evidence about pterosaur hatchlings now comes together.
They have all their forelimbs, they have their wing membranes. These tiny little pterosaurs could fly.
Flying babies challenge our ideas about flight, but so does a flying giant. Near Israel's Negev desert, investigators searching for an enormous new pterosaur must now corroborate their evidence. Dino Fry thinks they've got a gigantic bone, just one of 4 in the suspect's finger. 8,000 miles away in Mexico, they have giant footprints. Both clues suggest there once was a giant. But are they from the same suspect? If they could tie them together, the case would get much stronger. And that's what they do. By figuring out the age of the sites where the evidence was found, one in Mexico and one in Israel, they get a match. Both are about 71 million years old. But then Fry's case suffers a setback. A new test shows the big fossil from Israel isn't the evidence he thought it was. Under the microscope, a thin slice reveals patterns not visible to the naked eye. What Fry was convinced was bone turns out to be wood. Without the megafinger's fossil, Fry's case now rests on the tracks alone. Tracks he's sure were made by an ultra-giant pterosaur. He will use this trackway to figure out size. By taking measurements of foot and leg bones from other pterosaurs, he can scale them up to match the prints. What was the wingspan of the monster that once walked here? In the quest to understand pterosaur flight, investigators have zeroed in on a weird appendage, the tail. Early pterosaurs had long tails. 50 million years later, they'd begun to shrink. Their wings took up the slack, providing critical flight control. The history of aircraft shows the same progression. Early airplanes required big tails. Now, state-of-the-art craft can manage without them, but only because their wings are so sophisticated. Following the path of evolution, Gerritsen is shrinking the model's tail. But that will make stable flight harder. Now the wings will take on more steering control, just as in the real animal.
Now when we're moving the wings back like this, the pterosaur will start to dive down. Where we want to go up again, we're moving the wings forward.
Airplanes climb and descend in a completely different way.
You have a horizontal part on the tail called an elevator for up and down control. You have wing flaps, and those help you turn left and right. And those are used along with the rudder on the tail, which is a side-to-side motion.
But for a pterosaur without much tail, turning is more subtle.
To turn, we use twist of the wing. This would be a right turn. We're moving the right wing down and the left wing up. And when we do that, it will make the pterosaur bank like this through a turn. And if we want to go left, we do that same twist the other way around.
With its nimble wings, the model is nearly ready for its next flight test. But its body isn't finished evolving. Blood vessels reinforce the idea that a real pterosaur's membrane was living tissue. Another addition is more than cosmetic. Fossil evidence says the wings had hair. What was it for?
It's possible that, like the dimples on a golf ball, that the fur created a boundary that allowed the air to travel faster over the surface and created more lift.
It looks so real.
After its makeover, the replica is so lifelike that it's given a name, Herky, short for Hercules. And now Herky gets an accessory. It's something real pterosaurs never evolved or needed, a parachute. Pterosaurs were also known for weird head crests. This metal one is part of a system to keep the head pointed into the wind, as real pterosaurs likely did in the air. For this crucial test, a large remote-controlled airplane will carry Herky aloft and then drop it.
You want to check it?
This is going to be our first flight with fur on the wings. It could go unstable. But I think in generally, we're going to be quite all right with it. This is close to being the weirdest thing I've ever flown. Okay, mothership camera. Okay, lens cover off.
The team performs final checks at a makeshift mission control.
Should be on channel 2.
all systems look good. But there's one nagging worry.
We don't have these fast ways to control this, as a pterosaur could have done. Something goes wrong, pterosaur would immediately have controlled it. We don't have that. Our response is a lot slower. There are a lot of risks associated with this, and we could lose it.
Herky must rely on Michael Luvara's reflexes. A real pterosaur had a big advantage, a flight computer, its brain. A new discovery suggests that its brain could make precise micro-adjustments of the wing many times a second. In a major breakthrough, recent X-ray scans of their skulls revealed faint imprints of pterosaur brains. Pterosaurs had huge balance organs that were able to measure tiny changes in pitch, yaw, and roll. A large part of the brain helped keep the pterosaur's eyes steady during quick maneuvers, a critical skill for hunting. Controlling flight also requires gathering data from the wing as well as from the arm and leg joints that keep the membrane taut. This information was analyzed by another processor that was the core of the flight computer.
Okay.
With Luvara filling in for Herky's brain and a second pilot controlling the mothership, a gliding test of Herky's lifelike wing begins.
Altitude. Okay, one more lap.
The pterosaur will be released at a height of 700 feet.
Okay, countdown to launch. 5, 4, 3, 2,
1.
now.
The drop is clean. The next step is critical. The head, pointing straight ahead for takeoff, must be angled down into the realistic position.
300.
Oh.
But now Herky pitches down. Luvara tries to release the parachute. It doesn't respond.
Didn't have enough control.
Why did that parachute not come up?
Herky hits the ground nose first at 40 miles an hour. They thought they'd copied every detail, down to the hair on the wings. So what went wrong? Herky was built in 1 year, but it took nature millions of years to perfect real pterosaurs. That's because flight is one of the toughest skills an animal can master. Does Herky have the right stuff? Herky's a wreck.
You broke the neck.
$500,000 of technology and a year's work are in jeopardy.
The servo mount for the right pitch is broken.
Why didn't Herky fly like a real pterosaur? The postmortem reveals 3 problems. The first was a pterosaur brain malfunction. Luvara pushed one of his controllers in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Next, the fur undercut Herky's ability to glide. The role of fur on real pterosaur wings is now more mysterious than ever. Finally, cosmetic changes interfered with Herky's flight and took him straight into the ground.
No, no,
Herky is patched up and rebalanced.
Good luck, Herky.
Okay, wings are full forward. Keep going.
It's just lifting like crazy.
Start your right turn. That would be good on, for the launch curves.
That would be great for me.
Tell them we're keeping climbing.
Keeping climbing.
Climbing. That's a good right there. Okay, don't dive. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There it goes. Okay, head on.
Finally, Herky flies.
That is looking good.
Heads down. Coming at us. Landing.
That's beautiful. That was beautiful at the end.
For the first time in 65 million years, a nimble-winged pterosaur glided across the sky.
The neck is not broken. Does it still have a pulse?
But Herky and his kind didn't survive for millions of years just by gliding. They had to flap their wings. How did they do it? The answer again comes from birds and bats. They're the only two large animals alive today that can carry out a special wing motion that keeps them in the air. It's called the flight stroke.
If you want to get up in the air, you have to do a certain kind of motion with your arms. And you can't just flap like this, it doesn't work. It actually requires a stroke that's down and forward, up and back, down and forward, up and back.
Despite differences in their wing construction, birds and bats have similar flight strokes. But what about pterosaurs? Herky's flight stroke is a motion derived from fossil evidence. But figuring out a flight path for the moving wing is only half the problem. How did pterosaurs drive the motion? Pterosaurs had massive flapping muscles. In other words, they had a powerful engine.
I was looking at the structure of the pterosaur forelimbs and the hind limbs and could see that their wings were very strong. They were very powerful wings. They had big muscle attachments, and they could make what we call the flight stroke.
Pumping wings at high power for a long time is something only warm-blooded creatures like birds and bats can do. They have a racing metabolism, a V8 engine.
Taking to the air requires a lot of energy, and it requires sustained energy. If you want to stay up in the air, for safety's sake, you better be able to have a good energy reserve. Otherwise, you run out of gas and fall down in the middle of a big flight. It's not good for you.
But pterosaurs were reptiles, and all living reptiles are cold-blooded. Were pterosaurs warm-blooded reptiles? We can't take the temperature of a pterosaur, but we can determine how fast it grew. And fast growers tend to be warm-blooded.
If you look at the fine tissue structure of an animal's bones, you get a sense of how fast they're growing. That tissue is laid down differently in slow-growing and fast-growing animals.
Cold-blooded animals grow slowly, and the signature of this low-energy lifestyle is engraved in their bones. They don't have a lot of blood vessels to fuel growth. The bones of pterosaurs look completely different. They are jammed with blood vessels that feed fast growth.
Their bones show the same kind of tissue structure we see in fast-growing animals. That's very difficult to imagine doing without being something like what we would call warm-blooded today.
And there's one more convincing clue. It's a fossil of a pterosaur that had fur not only on the wings, but also on the body. Discovered recently in Inner Mongolia, it comes from an animal with a big motor. Only a warm-blooded beast needs fur to conserve heat.
They're burning energy like mad, and they're able to burn that energy in bursts when they really need to. Something about that kind of lifestyle requires a physiology like a bird that is burning fast and hot. Maybe pterosaurs would have felt warm if you touched one. They were everything but like today's reptiles.
In addition to strong muscles that operate at high power, a pterosaur needs one more feature to execute the flight stroke. A strong airframe. And that's exactly what they have. Its core is a huge breastbone. It's braced to a framework of bones, including the shoulders. This chassis is where the powerful flapping muscles attach. This design of muscle and bone makes up the pterosaur's engine. So how will Herky evolve something like that?
The flapping takes a lot of power. There's a big wings, and it's flying at high speed. So we need a big motor.
But the motor adds weight. An analysis of the last flight showed Herky was already heavy and descended too fast. Why?
All this cosmetics that we put on actually took us back in flight ability.
The elaborate head weighed too much. So Herky gets a lightweight replacement. And there's another problem. The paint they applied to the wings.
It changed the elasticity of the wing. And so what we had to do is to go back to material as still as stretchy as we really needed it.
So to fly more like a real pterosaur, Herky has to look less like one. Shaved and in fighting trim, Herky evolves from glider to flapper. On a 300-foot steel cable, Herky gets his first chance to try out his flight stroke.
What I really liked about today's test was how the flapping cycle looked. It looks very natural. We have the wings going in and out, as the pterosaur would have done and birds do. And I think that makes a tremendous difference.
In an animal defined by its wings, the flight stroke is the key to survival. It let pterosaurs control the planet's skies. It may have even let them fly at birth. Along with a megafinger and a layered wing membrane, it's an essential secret of pterosaur flight. It may explain how these animals evolved into one of the planet's most skilled flyers. And it may also help explain the stunning results of the investigation into the largest animal that ever took to the skies. Herky's been worked over, crash tested, and refined. He's as close to a real pterosaur as the team can make him. But is he close enough? wing finger and a prayer, Herky takes off for the last time.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go.
Now it's time to flap. After a single flight stroke, the wings jam. Herky's engine is too weak. He can't even get his wings back to level. Lavara bails out.
She worked.
About 50 feet, 40, 20, touchdown.
Well, it doesn't look too bad. I think the curse should save us.
Yeah.
Turn it off. I think we lost our clutch and gearing.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, look at that. That's why it didn't flap.
I think we were spinning the motor with nothing. Yeah, the whole clutch system came apart. How about that?
Oh, that explains a lot.
Well,
It turns out that Herky was a runt.
yeah.
Later calculations revealed that his flapping motor had only half the power a real pterosaur would have had. Still, Herky's wings helped rewrite the book on pterosaur flight.
I'm really proud of the design of the wings. We built a wing that behaves beautifully in gliding flight. We can control the shape, and by controlling it, we can steer the pterosaur. So that's been fantastic.
But the real animals set an almost impossibly high standard. It was only by building Herky that we figured out just how skilled they were. They had the right stuff for flight, and they used it to conquer the globe. Tenacious hunters, they adapted to different diets. Filtering, probing, scavenging, and in a tour de force of flight control, grabbing fish on the wing.
They were quite amazing. Compared to every living animal that I know, every living flyer or man-made flyer, I think the pterosaurs beat them all.
In his hunt for a giant, Dino Fry now compares the sizes of footprints with fossil pterosaur bones and reaches a stunning conclusion.
It became clear that there were pterosaurs that have a wingspan of more than 70 feet, which is simply unbelievable.
Fry thinks it may be the largest creature ever to fly. It would have been a monster, more Airbus than animal, almost beyond comprehension. Its eye may have been the size of a basketball. Its egg may have been as big as a playground trash can. And its wings would have been so long, it could have almost dunked at both ends of the court at the same time.
Pterosaurs in general are such an enigmatic, interesting group because every time we think we know something about them, we're wrong.
As a pterosaur is scaled up to gargantuan size, weight goes up faster than power. And this may give us an idea about how the ultra-giant would have flown.
If you're that big, you're certainly not going to be actively flapping for very long at a clip. Anything that big is going to have to be soaring most of the time.
So, how could such a giant have fueled its flight?
Most likely, they only could collect food, which was easy to get.
In other words, pretty much anything that crossed its path.
That must have been so impressive, and I can't describe you what I would do to see that live.
The ultra-giant would have felt nature's force just like any other creature. After ruling the skies for 150 million years, the sky monsters and the planet suffer a calamity. An asteroid strikes the Earth. By one theory, the aftermath wipes out the dinosaurs. The monstrous marine reptiles disappear too. And pterosaurs, master flyers, are gone forever. The skies are left to the birds and the bats. But for all their majesty, they'll never match the grandeur and weirdness of the greatest creatures to ever take wing.
Dragons, of course, are fantastical creatures. Jaws full of teeth, huge wings. These, of course, are myths, never existed, but there were creatures who had all this. They were huge, they had big teeth, they had claws, and they were the pterosaurs.